In November 2020, a happy, healthy 9-month-old baby was returned to the full-time custody of his parents, having spent his short life in care. 39 days later, he was dead, the victim of sustained physical abuse and neglect at the hands of those who should have loved him the most. This is what happens when the courts and safeguarding services are all too easily fooled by lying, evil abusers. This is the murder of Finley Boden. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. You've asked me to cover this case. It's really recent. It's taken me a little bit of a while to gather all the information that I need to get this across appropriately. And just before I start this case, the actual investigation into the failings haven't been completed, so I can only tell you where we are up to now in the context of covering this particular murder. I sat looking at the research, feeling absolutely distraught. I really did. To look at how safeguarding, which we take really seriously in the UK, for all the failures that we hear about, we do. But to be able to look into a case and see the abhorrent failures, it's unbelievable, because we're talking about a baby who should have been safe and could have been saved. And yet here we are today with me covering his demise, his downfall, at the very hands of the people who should have moved heaven and earth to save him. Thank you for joining me, by the way. If you're new to this channel, I've just launched into it without first introducing myself. I release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday. I do that religiously, so if you like crime and consistency and you like to know what you'll be doing on those evenings, or those mornings, or those afternoons, depending on where you are in the world, then this is definitely the channel for you. As ever, guys, I know that I cover quite a lot of child death. I think that is just down to the fact that I worked in safeguarding of children for a long time, and it is so important that we provide legacy for these victims. They may not have had lives fully lived, nor in these cases fully loved, but my God, they meant something to this world. And I think that we have to learn, and we have to investigate, and we have to listen to things that are really painful, because unless we're willing to do that, to some degree, the lives of these babes, they get lost. And I don't want them to get lost in the collateral noise of our busy lives. I want them to have absolute meaning. I'm going to take you back to 2020. This is a really recent case. It's one I've followed, and quite a lot of you have requested it. And I wanted to obviously do some other cases in between, because I do cover a lot of children. And hopefully today you will feel as enraged as I do, but also you will feel that sense of how different you are to the kind of people that I'm going to talk about today. Because there is one thing that I'm absolutely assured of on this channel, is that the people who come here, you guys in my community, you people who follow me on Patreon and YouTube membership and who return here every time I release content, the compassion that you have is beautiful and at times astonishing. And it's a constant theme within the content that I make. So I know that you are going to treat this little boy, who deserves so much more, with the love, respect and due concern that he deserved and deserves. So back in 2020, we've got 10-month-old Finley Boden. He's living with his parents, 20-year-old Shannon Marsden and 28-year-old Stephen Boden. So immediately we were introduced to a very clear age gap. I am fully aware that there is nothing illegal about this relationship, and lots of people have relationships with far older people, and that's fine. This is not me criticising that aspect of it. However, what I would say is, when you think about being 28 and then you think about being 20, that 8-year gap is quite substantial, because if you think about 8 years before, at 20, you were 12, so you're a very small kid, and at 28, you're 20 if you take the 8 years off. And the consequence of that is one of you has got a lot more wisdom, preparedness, and an understanding of how the world and relationships work. So there'll be more naivety to a 20-year-old than there will be a 28-year-old. And in normal terms, that's not a problem, because 28-year-olds are going to treat their 20-year-old partners really nicely. But if there is a power dynamic issue, then we have to bring that as a concern and a potential exacerbator of certain negativity in relationships if the older party, shall we say, has a level of deeper malevolence. By the way, I'm going to say right at the beginning, I have absolutely no sympathy or empathy for Shannon whatsoever. My God, she deserves everything that she gets. But just to highlight that there can be a power imbalance in that moment. Now, they're living in a terraced house on Holland Road in Old Whittington, which is Chesterfield in Derbyshire. And one of the reasons I'm covering this case is just recently I've gone and done my Serial Killer Next Door tour in Chesterfield, and I was specifically asked to cover this case by several of the people that I met afterwards. So just to recognise that this has come from a place where people feel absolutely connected to what happened and absolutely disgusted by the fact that their community lost Finley. Now, what is really striking about this case is that Finley had actually only been back in the custody of his parents for a matter of weeks. So initially, he'd been removed by social services, and this had just been shortly after his birth. So they had some real clear concerns. Marsden, she was only 17 when she'd actually met Boden. They'd met in 2017. And as I've said, that seniority of 8 years is quite a considerable difference, but I would say that what really attracted them to one another was a common feature. They really enjoyed smoking cannabis. I appreciate there'll be people watching in places like America where there is a legalized standard for cannabis, and I am the first person to note that most people smoking cannabis are not bad people in any way, shape or form. However, there is a minority of individuals who take drugs of any type that use it inappropriately and at a cost to everything around them. And that is the territory we are working in right now. So when it comes down to this couple, cannabis dominates their lives. It's all that matters to them. Boden had actually smoked it from the age of 9. He'd obviously been brought up in a dysfunctional way. We don't have children smoking cannabis at 9 years old unless there is firstly a level of dysfunction and secondly a level of neglect. And then Marsden, they had actually started drinking at age 9 and smoking cannabis at age 10. So again, she is somebody who's experienced a neglectful environment. And it may, from the outside looking in, have seemed that both of them were potentially cared for. But I'm going to tell you, if your kids are getting access to that kind of stuff at those ages, it's neglectful parenting, end of. And when I looked into their backgrounds, dysfunction plays a big role within it. And I think that at this point we can say, when you think about having a child and bringing a child into the world, the reality is that they are not good parent material. Now, Finley ends up getting born on the 17th of February 2020, but his parents' really heavy drug use and also the horrific state of their house. I mean, their house was really untidy, it was really unclean, and it was not a safe environment at all for a baby. So when a visit is done on their property, they can see they are literally living in squalor. And again, for a younger person, it's not something we can excuse, but if you go back, shall we say, to your student days at university, and, you know, when it came down to washing up, might happen occasionally. We all know the rows you get into in student halls of residence, for example, because when you're a kid and you've left home, you're not necessarily that equipped for doing things like cleaning pans after you've burnt stuff on them. So again, I can have a sympathy and empathy for a younger person who maybe is living on their own for the first time, maybe hasn't had the best foundations and the best opportunities to develop life skills, struggling in that area. But when you've got like a 28-year-old as well, no. Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, you should have your stuff together in your life. You should know how to tidy up. And to be living in squalor, whether you are stoned or otherwise, there are a lot of stoners around. The houses are immaculate. They're pretty chilled and laid back. They keep things clean. This is not a reason to allow your home to literally fall into disrepair and disgust. And that's what they're dealing with. And we're not talking about the odd pot and pan that's being left inappropriately. We're not talking about clothes being on the floor. Look, we all get into those situations. We are talking about people walking in and they're instantly hit with this horrific smell of urine. There are flies everywhere. They've got dog feces all over the floor. Believe me, when I started my second job, I would do home visits, and I cannot tell you the amount of times I went to, I would say, very deprived areas with very deprived parents, with very deprived aspirations. And I would literally walk out of the house and find that I had dog feces on my shoes because I had stepped in them in the house. And it is really disconcerting when that happens, because you're looking and thinking, my God, you know, there are 4 children under the age of 5 in that house. And it is really upsetting because you know it's the worst kind of environment for any child to be in. Now, on top of this, they've got this drug habit, which is massively prioritised in their world. So for their son, he is simply not in the picture. He just isn't their concern. You can tell that by the disrespect they have for their home, the disrespect that they have for their bodies, and certainly, therefore, the disrespect that they have for a child who needs care. But there's also, on top of all the things that I've just talked about, a real physical risk posed by Boden. So Boden isn't just older, he's also somebody who is really not pro-social in any way, shape or form. So he was somebody that they were very concerned about being around his son. So he'd previously actually been convicted of domestic violence. I'm going to throw it out there, and I'm going to say this again and again, and I appreciate that we always believe in the fact that people can change and people should definitely be given second chances. But when you have a young man like this who has already been done for domestic abuse and he's getting to be around a child full stop, I just have deep, grave concerns. I think he has proven himself to not be a safe person around females or around babies, full stop. And therefore, I don't think you should allow a child to be in the presence of somebody like that. Also, he had 22, and that's right. Think about his age. That's almost an offence for every year. 22 convictions. Now, he'd actually been charged with 33 offences, but only been found guilty of 22 previous convictions. But the point is, we are looking at a very high-level offender. Is that the kind of person that should be around any child? And the crimes that he was involved in, some would say they were relatively petty, so theft, criminal damage, etc. But domestic abuse is a high-level offence, and he's also been found guilty of that. And one of the things that the neighbours said, and that people who knew the relationship between the two of Boden and Marsden, was that they were constantly fighting. They had these really fierce physical arguments. Now, again, I am one of those people who understands that relationships can have physical outcomes for both parties. I appreciate that males and females can get into scenarios where they both retaliate on a physical level. But the expectation is, because of the physical domination of the male in the relationship, his advantage means that he should never hit back. Now, I know that might feel really unfair, and I appreciate that guys who are physically abused by their partners, who actually never retaliate, they sit there and recognise that sometimes we forget about the strength and the courage that they have in those moments of not retaliating and reacting. When many of us might look in and think, well, why didn't you? At the end of the day, she was attacking you with A, B or C. But that is the way our society is essentially created and formed and biased to some degree stereotypically, because females are far less able critically to fight back against a male. Even a small male can usually dominate a much bigger female. The fact that he is happy to dominate her in that way is something that is deeply concerning. There is no protective mechanism there. There is an absolute clarity that escalation and amplification can occur, and that can lead to some very dire outcomes. That is why women every single week die in domestically abusive scenarios. But they have this really aggressive relationship between the two of them, but they're also very intense. So I would say that on top of all the other things that we have a problem with, we've also got an intensity between the two of these where on top of the priority regarding the actual weed smoking, and according to the reality that they don't put a lot of energy into cleaning their environment, part of that is also down to the fact that they are very intense towards one another. So they have what I would say is, to some degree, a bit of an unbreakable bond, which is weird when you think about what I've just talked about character-wise between the both of them. But then a folie à deux is always that way. You get two people who should not meet, who should not be together, and they are, and the most disastrous consequences arrive because of it. Now, before Finley was actually born, he gets made the subject of a child protection plan, and that's excellent because we want that for him. So Derbyshire Social Services, they intervene because they are really concerned about his well-being and they take him into care. And they actually identified that he was a serious risk of harm if he stayed with his parents. So he had this serious risk of being very detrimentally impacted if he were to live with his mother and father. And that is absolutely the right decision. But Boden, Marsden, they're not happy with that. Now, in spite of the fact that they show very little interest in this child, what they clearly don't like is authority taking control over their opportunity to parent, even though they were not parenting at all. So they decide that they are going to absolutely convince the authorities that they are suitable parents. On one level, we would hope that parents who have a child removed are going to do everything in their power to prove to social care services that they are absolutely the right people to have that child back. We want that. It's excellent when a child can be taken from parents. The parents make great effort to change. With the support, they have that child returned and hopefully things work out. But there is a tiny percentage of individuals who don't really care about the child whatsoever, but they damn right care about people having power over them. And that's what we're talking about as far as I'm concerned with Boden and Marsden. Whilst that little boy, that gorgeous little boy that I know every single one of us would have happily opened our homes to in a heartbeat, he flourishes. He's an absolutely happy, healthy baby. And there are videos of him that are just heartbreaking to watch because he's just smiling and giggling and thriving. It's that sense when you're around a really happy, secure baby who just exudes that sense of being in the moment and just being completely content within that moment and feeling safe. That's a big part of this. The fact that you have those videos where he is smiling and giggling and just seemingly enjoying the moment, it's because he doesn't have any worries or anxieties, because he's in a good place. So social care have made the absolute correct decision. The services involved have gone out of their way to protect him. Now, I'm the first person to criticise when people fail to do that, but their plan was correct. In fact, it's going to astonish you what happens down the line because they got it right. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about 2020. And of course, what happened in 2020? The world went mad. So in the spring of 2020, country goes into COVID lockdown. I know that there are some people who come to this channel who get really pissed off with me, being political, as you call it. Well, the political belief system that I held about COVID lockdown was very simple. You don't lock abusers up with their children. It's that. You don't lock women up with their domestic abusers and men up with theirs. It's just never going to end well, and it didn't statistically. So yes, I did have very politicised views because my experience in safeguarding is we do not stop caring in present form with visits to homes, etc. Those children in the biggest need, because it can result in the most terrifying of outcomes, and it has. That's why I'm covering this case today. So I apologise to those of you who feel that I bring my politics into this, but my politics comes from the psychological efficacy of my career and the knowledge that I have within that, and the disastrous impact and effects that this kind of ruling had on the lives of innocents. And also the workers who could not do their jobs and have to live with the consequences of feeling that they failed these children, because bear in mind, there are a lot of individuals traumatized by that experience. So we go into this COVID lockdown. Now, normally, social workers would have been continuing to do routine home visits because Obviously, their priority is to check if there's any improvements in Marsden and Boden's living conditions. But because the government decided that that wasn't okay, and they put these restrictions down, instead of those social workers being allowed to actually go and do a home visit, instead they had to basically look at photographs that the individual couple sent in. So just analyse that with me for a moment. If you are in a situation where you know you got to send some photographs into social services so that they can assess whether your home's clean, you ain't going to be taking Polaroids, are you? The current scenario, and just printing them out looking like a right mess and whacking them in an envelope. And by the way, I do know they will have done it digitally. I'm just throwing in some 1980s humour. But the reality is, you are going to tidy your home. Like, how long does it take to shove things under the sofa and to throw things to the side? It's really easy to make your house look clean. Are we really in a universe of stupidity to the degree where we think we can trust that the pictures that parents who want to get their child back are sending authentic pictures? This is why we get angry when social services and social workers actually go and do home visits where they've told the people they'll be there. Because that gives people an option and a license to change their environment and make it look more suitable. When it comes down to unexpected home visits, we're all on that bus, because at the end of the day, you want to catch people unawares. Because social services aren't going to people's homes to basically try to cause them issues. They're going to people's homes to try to make sure that children are protected. And they're not stupid. If they walk into a house and there are like plates on the floor and clothes on the floor, and that's normal. No one cares about that stuff. That doesn't stop you being a loving parent. But if you walk in and there are flies and excrement on the floor and your child looks neglected, or the child looks bruised, that gives you a real opportunity to protect. And the fact is that the government allowed this kind of travesty to play out. So they send in photographs, and of course, there's progress been made. You know, they've changed the ways, house looks clean and tidy, no evidence of drug paraphernalia, as if there would be. Could you imagine? Just gonna take a few pictures. Can you just get all of the crap that's on the floor? We definitely want to send that in. And ideally, if you can make sure that all of the weed paraphernalia is in there, I've actually got some new bits and pieces that I've invested in last week. And if you can just put the rotten food that's in the corner, just take a picture of that as well, because I really want to show them an authentic reality of what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Said nobody who's dependent ever. They're obviously going to give the best impression. And it's a simple way. At the end of the day, COVID allowed us to do those things. It's reprehensible. It's completely at a loss where professionality is concerned, because anybody knows, including those social workers who would have been questioning this, I have no doubt whatsoever, that those professionals were thinking this does not look as we expect, but they're having to go off the protocol and the system that's changed. So we get to the summer of 2020. This is where a lot of people were making carrot cake and banana bread and posting it on Instagram because they were on furlough, and where a lot of other people were starving, and where a lot of other people were in abusive situations because the government just kept going with a malpractice so horrific that the consequences are what I'm talking about today. So for those of you who are going to write comments about my political beliefs, save your breath. Because if you cannot see why they existed, well, the truth is, you would therefore feel that what I'm discussing today was something that was unavoidable when it's absolutely avoidable. By the way, I know that 99.9% of you absolutely understand my perspective, but I do get them. And I just want to make it clear that I have no apologies and never will apologise for my views. Human beings are incredibly important. Children are the most important and most vulnerable people in our world. And I don't care how people feel about me. I care about the fact that I absolutely 100% have a sense of advocacy for the most vulnerable, and always will have until I take my dying breath. So during the summer of 2020, this is all happening. And we get to a point where it starts to ease. Do you remember? Eat out to help out. Yeah, that happened in the UK where you got 2 for 1 on unhealthy food types at restaurants. So you could out to help out. But at this point, we see Marsden and Boden being allowed these kind of supervised visits with Finley. And again, absolutely spot on. So this is good social care, it really is, because they are grading, are these people able to be around this child? And in total, they had 16 contact sessions, so that's a relatively large amount, and they turned up. So that's really good. The social worker is going to be really invested in that. And they're really nice to Finley during this period of time. They're cuddling him, they're kissing him. And to all intents and purposes, what the social workers saw was that there seemed to be a genuine love. There seemed to be a genuine affection for the son. They used particular kind of language. So they referred to him as perfect. They called him a cuddly, chunky munchkin. And that is absolutely contextual. We expect that, don't we? As loving parents, we're always giving our kids really weird nicknames. I still have mine for my children, and they very much like it when I refer to them like that in public amongst their adult friends. But basically, they're seeing these interactions, they're seeing the photos of their home, which I think they'd have been massively skeptical of. But then if you mirror that and parallel it with the fact that they're now being really nice to their child when they're doing supervised visits, absolutely have empathy with the social workers who are concluding that the couple are actually capable of making changes and that they've done so. So when it comes down to them reporting to the family court, the social worker actually described Marsden and Boden as attentive and loving parents. And it's very easy, isn't it, for monsters to wear masks? We all know that. Some of you will have been in relationships with monsters who wore masks. And when they're around your family and your friends and your colleagues, they'll be super lovely, super charming, because it's only for a short period of time. The fact that when you get home behind closed doors, they insult you, control you, beat you, you can see how confusing that level of experience is. And certainly for the social workers, they're only having this period of time with the parents and with Finley, and they're having to base their assumptions on that. Even though we all appreciate that isn't going to give a rounded and full picture. But it makes sense that they're kind of feeding this back, particularly to the family court who has to make these decisions. So then we get to the 1st of October 2020. This is when the family court hearing takes place. It's all about trying to determine whether Finley's future could be with the parents. So the custody arrangements, is it possible to feel that we are safe sending this child, who's very vulnerable, who's had a very difficult start, who's now thriving, back to the full-time care of the parents? Now, usually, this would happen in a family court because, you know, that's how it's meant to work. And also, people have to turn up, they have to look a certain way, ideally dress in a respectful manner, because all of these things can kind of help people make decisions over whether the child should be returned home. However, of course, we're still dealing with the pantomime of COVID restrictions, and so they decided it's okay to make it take place over the phone. At this point, Boden stated that he and Marsden were now totally focused. They'd worked really hard to make changes. Marsden stated that she just adored Finley, she loved Finley, was incredibly happy at the prospect of him being returned to her care. And essentially, this is what the court want to hear. And bear in mind, this is what social services want to hear as well. And they're doing a really good job of appearing like they really have their shit together. And bear in mind, social services want children returned to the parents if it's possible. So this is something that looks like it's working out. So with the backing of social services, at this point, it's decided that custody should be granted to them. But, and again, I always say this, if there are failings within the social care, with social workers, etc., I'm always going to come down hard on it, right? But they did everything right in this circumstance at this point. They did. So they haven't had an option to go and do home visits. They haven't had an option to judge anything other than based on the information they've been given. But even though it's all looking good, the social workers are like, just let's hang on. Let's just hang on, because we aren't absolutely entirely sure that Finley will be going home to a safe home. So what we need is a very structured, gradual transition back to full-time custody. Absolutely 100%. Who could deny that that isn't the correct procedure? Because they're saying, look, we want to get him home, but we want to get him home really safely. We want to be able to track it, check it out, make sure Finley's happy. Because whilst the drug use that they knew was a problem in the couple's lives, it had appeared to decrease, they still had these concerns. On top of that, they still had the original concerns about whether they'd legitimately have the skills and resources and parenting capacity to care for Finley full time. And one social worker actually concluded that should Marsden and Boden stop making positive changes and fall back into the old habits that we know existed, Finley would be really at risk of suffering from neglect and physical and emotional harm. So I dread to think what the impact has been on that social worker. I dread to think how this case has played out in their mind. Because this is somebody who knew what they were doing. They were obviously an adept professional. They know safeguarding. And their concern was not the parents, their concern was Finley. And the fact that they actually noted to be at risk of suffering from neglect, physical and emotional harm, that demonstrates the softly approach that would have prevented what I'm talking about playing out today. This particular social worker then went on to say that there was a suggested 4-month monitored transition period back to full-time care. And on top of that, they wanted Marsden and Boden to undergo regular drug testing. This feels like a very, very effective package. We have the parents being tested for drugs so we can tell that they are absolutely committed to the process. And most importantly, we have a child being monitored for at least 16 weeks. That is a powerful package of safeguarding. After all, at the end of the day, the child's needs are paramount in these situations. Paramount concern is given to what they may endure, and the needs and the wishes need to be thought of. And in this case, this child can't tell you what the needs and wishes are, so we have to decide what they will be. And keeping him safe, this plan would work. But riddle me this, guys, riddle me this. The magistrate, who's hearing the case, in their infinite wisdom, whilst they're obviously dealing with things completely above their pay packet, genuinely, I mean that. Because for anybody who thinks that when they've heard these professionals guide them to make the right decision, even though this magistrate, and I'm sorry, a magistrate has a complete lack of legal qualifications, I would be more adept at making decisions than a magistrate. And I'm sorry if you're a magistrate listening, but with respect, you will also know why I'm saying that. We're in a completely different ballpark to the way the legal system actually gives us insight to the problems and ramifications of making decisions when you don't really have the knowledge. So this magistrate just rejects the recommendations. Yeah, they know better. They know better than all the people who've been involved in this case. They know better than social workers who cut their teeth and live their lives trying to protect these children. After the phone call, bear in mind, it lasted less than 2 hours, the magistrate ruled that Finley was to be returned to his parents' full-time care. And that had to happen within an 8-week transition. And then they'd have some supervision afterwards. But also, it was agreed that the case could return to court after a 4-month period. So they've completely diluted the actual reality of what social services want. And obviously they said, well, you know, you can still look at this case, you can still be satisfied that Finley's rehabilitation is occurring, but why didn't they listen to the people who'd worked this case? So we get to the 17th of November, this is 2020 still. Finley, at this point, is a really happy, healthy, vibrant, thriving 9-month-old baby. And for some bizarre reason, in spite of everything that's been said, he's returned to the full-time care of his parents. That's the full-time care of his parents for the first time in his short life. So the very fact that he's going to have some psychological and attachment issues going back to relative strangers, apart from the 16 hours that they've shared with him, that in itself would suggest a much more staged approach. But hey, the magistrate has decided that they know more than everybody else, so let's just go for it. And that little boy gets returned, and 39 days later, he is dead. Why do I have to speak sentences like that? It does not surprise you, it does not surprise me that as soon as he's home, Marsden and Boden didn't bother to carry on the facade. You know, this mask of being these amazing parents. Yeah, it's all BS. So instead of the main focus at this point being the welfare of the child, now that they've worked so hard to get that child back, albeit that they just had to pretend they were nice for 16 literal supervised contact hours, and on top of that, just pretend the house was tidy by sending in photographs. I mean, that's really the amount of work that they put into it, but even that's too much to continue. So their return with their son sees a return to their really negative behaviour, so excessive drug use that's always dominated their lives. But remember, the pictures that they sent didn't have any drugs paraphernalia in it, so obviously that suggested that they were really happy and healthy and really thriving as adults. But it seems like when they've got him back and they've got that power and control back, and they know that they have won as far as they're concerned, all that matters at that moment in time is finding cash to fund their habit. And I do think that they probably just wanted extra benefits. They probably wanted their child benefit, etc. And if he's present, they're going to get it. So arguably, he's probably provided them with some extra drug money. Now, social services do absolutely the right thing, and they do an unannounced visit in December 2020, and it's really concerning. So a social worker actually witnesses a drug deal taking place. Then on another occasion, a social worker just peers through the window and they look, and Finley is just laid by himself on a sofa with no adults around. So these are real red flags. And this behaviour is bad enough, obviously, because it shows an abject neglect of this little boy. But what's also happening behind closed doors is that there is a sustained campaign of physical abuse, and it begins pretty immediately from his return. And when we consider what Finley was enduring and experiencing before this, he was living a life that every child wishes. He was cared for, he was loved, he was compassionately treated, he was fed, he was warm, he was given the nurture that he absolutely deserved. And that's the very basics of what a child deserves. So he's gone from this wonderful experience of being completely cared for to being in the most heinous of situations, deeply dangerous for him. He must have been terrified, absolutely terrified. He goes from a place where he is familiar and knowledgeable about his environment, about his caregivers, to a place that is unfamiliar, violent, disgustingly dirty, surrounded with drugs. I cannot even begin to comprehend how his little brain was trying to compute that experience. And of course, what is a child going to do initially when they're scared, when they're hungry, when they're neglected, when they're alone? They're going to get upset. And you can imagine if people don't have a toleration for this kind of reality with children, they're going to react and amplify negative behaviours. So it's an absolute cooking pot of a disaster for this kid. Now, it seems when it comes down to the abuse, you won't be surprised that Boden was the ringleader, but Marsden does absolutely nothing to help Finley. In fact, it feels like she wasn't just a bystander looking in, feeling helpless, although obviously she's going to play that card at some point, but she gets involved as well. She actively engages. Now, in the short time, because remember, we're talking about 39 days, in that short period, he would go on to suffer countless injuries. I mean, he was caught, he was bruised, he had so many broken bones. And of course, this is exacerbated when we think about the horror of his situation because they didn't get him any medical care. Now, if you don't get medical care and there are broken bones and there are cuts and there are bruises and you're vulnerable immunity because you're a baby, it's going to lead to infection. And that's exactly what happens. He gets infection throughout his body. He gets pneumonia and ultimately sepsis. Now, for those of you who watch regularly, you'll know that, yes, I lost my father to suicide. But what many of you might not know is that my father actually began to lose his fight with life because he got sepsis after a water infection. And sepsis causes a whole heap of things, including delirium. And delirium tripped into psychosis. And that's how my father ended up dead. Sepsis kills in a multitude of ways. But for a baby, sepsis is going to be unbelievably painful. and it's going to cause catastrophic loss of function in the vital organs. It's a shutting down of the body. And to imagine this child is going to end up that way is just absolutely horrific, when we bear in mind that these are all inflicted by his caregivers. Marsden and Boden acted like a tag team. They worked together to carry out the abuse, to hide the abuse, and neighbours actually didn't hear Finley screaming. And the reason that they didn't hear him screaming, so he wasn't even afforded the chance of somebody making that call to emergency services because they could hear a child in distress, they worked to prevent that by covering Finley's mouth. So one of them would hurt him and one of them would cover his mouth whilst he was being hurt so they could inflict the injuries without being discovered. The fact that they were so aware that their abuse was wrong means that they are absolutely consequential. They knew that what they were doing was horrific. They knew that it was illegal and they knew there'd be consequences. They went out of their way to prevent detection. Also, they would spend hours out of the house, and they did that for another really good reason, because they knew that social service were concerned and they might do another surprise call. So by staying out of the home, they avoided that surprise inspection from social services. So he really is a captor. It's like seeing a child essentially abducted, because all of the safeguards that should have been there to protect him have just been totally taken away. We get to mid-December, which for most parents out there will know is one of the most exciting times, whether you're rich or poor, whether you've got finances to splash on your children, whether you've got very little, it doesn't matter, because we make Christmas magical for our babes. We really do. It's a time where, particularly on your first Christmas with your babies, you're just excited. Everything's about potential, but not these. We get to mid-December, so this is just a month after they've been granted custody. And at this point, my gosh, it would have been absolutely evident from what I've read that Marsden and Boden would have known Finley was seriously ill. And I mean seriously ill. So first of all, he's no longer able to sit up and play with his toys. That's a big red flag. When a child stops showing interest in those ways, you know that there is a problem. He was struggling to breathe, and the reason he was struggling to breathe is because pneumonia had set into his lungs. And you could hear that, it's audible. Any of you out there who, like me, have had a child who got quite seriously ill at childhood, and particularly as a baby, which is what happened to my second boy, I could hear the rattling, I could hear the wheezing of pneumonia, and it's terrifying. But despite the fact that it's very obvious, and believe me, it's obvious, it's something that as a mother you are rhythmically involved with, you're kind of like breathing with them. The first thing you're going to do is get medical treatment, because you know they're going to need antibiotics, you know that they're going to need some kind of help, probably oxygen, certainly care by professionals who know what they're doing. They did nothing for him. They didn't even take him to a GP. They didn't take him to hospital. And they actually actively ensured that no other service provider would actually have any access to him either. And the reason for that is they claimed that Finley had COVID. Of course they did. I mean, isn't that just the blanket excuse for every single bad behaviour during the pandemic? That this little baby has COVID, so he needs to isolate. And of course, what can anybody do in that moment? There are all these instructions. You can't go to the home. You can't go and do a visit. Literally, you weren't even allowed to your doctors. It's insane. But everything is perfect for them, isn't it? Everything allows them the opportunity to continue this sustained attack of abuse and to protect themselves from the eyes of those who could make a difference to this little boy and his life being saved. So they use this excuse. He's got COVID. That means that the health visitor appointment's cancelled. That was scheduled for the 21st of December 2020. And that means that the only people who could ever have saved him were prevented from even seeing him. And we all know that if somebody had seen him in that state, it would have been a different outcome. Finley is literally at the mercy of his abusers, and they work together. They're lying, they're protecting each other. They literally watched their 10-month-old little baby boy struggling to breathe, slowly dying before their eyes from the injuries that they had inflicted, whilst they just continue to buy drugs and get stoned. Honestly, the rage I feel within me makes me just want to inflict the same level of damage on these reprehensible excuses for humans, to see how they would feel when they can't catch their breath, when their lungs are full of catarrh and infection, so that they struggle to even feel the soothing oxygen reaching their lungs, because the fact that they were so accepting and so at peace with their actions just demonstrates the kind of humans, or lack of humanity, within the humans we're discussing. The last time that Finley is actually seen in public was on Christmas Eve. That's the 24th of December 2020. So that afternoon we've got Marsden. He's seen pushing his pram through Chesterfield Market. And bear in mind how cold it was, and we've got a really, really sick child. Later that evening, we've got Boden seen pushing his pram in a supermarket, and we can all go, oh, well, did they just not know? Were they completely disassociated from reality? No, they were doing that because they wanted people to see them with his pram. They obviously think that if they can make the public believe that actually they were doing normal parenting responsibilities, maybe that will look less like they are the murderous killers we're discussing. That's why they did it. There is a cunning behind it. It's not going to work, but there is a cunning behind it. Because why would you take a child out who's that sick unless you were a caring, loving parent who just didn't understand how ill they were? It is horrific to imagine, to conceive, that Finley at this point would have been in absolutely horrific pain. He was literally dying in his pram at that moment. We get to 2:33 a.m. on Christmas Day, 2020, Christmas Day, the day where our babes are allowed a moment of magic, just allowed to bask in the beauty that every parent on the whole creates. Genuinely, like I said, it's not about money, it's about what parents do and how we react and how we act in the magic of those moments that makes Christmas truly incredible. But that's not going to be the case for Finley. Finley's never going to get to grow up into a family surrounded in love and excitement. Finley's not going to go outside and put the reindeer dust on the garden like so many children will. Finley's not going to get to have that little car that he always wanted. He's never going to go and sit on Father Christmas's knee. He's never going to do all the things that every single one of us would wish for that child to experience. Because on Christmas Day 2020, Boden and Marsden finally call the ambulance. At this point, Finley's totally unresponsive. And by this time, it would be clear that, without any doubt, Finley was already dead. When the paramedics arrive on Christmas Day, it's instant for them. They look around, they can see that, first of all, Finley is absolutely dirty, very unkept. There's marks and wounds around his nose, around his mouth, and they can tell that he has suffered a cardiac arrest. They rush him to hospital. They're desperate because even though it looks very grave, they'll do everything in their power to save him, but they can't. He's pronounced dead at 3:45 a.m. He was 10 months old. If it's not bad enough what I have described, and of course we cannot expect the behaviour of these individuals to change too much, but one could imagine in the recesses of our hopeful mind that at this moment they both realise the gravity, the enormity of what's happened. The fact that this child that was given back to them is now dead. You would hope that there would be a desperation, a realisation, something that would spark the conscience of these killers. But no. Shortly after Finley's death, Boden is basically heard telling Marsden that he would sell Finley's pram on eBay. Yeah, because obviously he's not thinking about the fact that his son's dead. That doesn't concern him. He's concerned about the fact that now he can sell the pram and get some money for the next weed deal. Now, later down the line, because he's questioned on this, it's heard, and of course, any well-adjusted human being who overhears it is going to do one of two things. One, take the pram, shove it somewhere up an orifice where he will deal with the agony that a normal human being would wish to inflict on somebody in this moment, having said something like that. Or, I don't know, for a more rational, less reactive like myself feeling kind of human, it's going to be something you register, right? And they register it. So it's brought up down the line. He says, oh, all this was a comment that I wanted to lighten the mood with. I mean, there's a dead baby. No one thinks about lightening the mood with a dead baby. If you haven't seen my Mick Philpott video, it's one of my really first ones, and it's probably useless compared to this because now I know what I'm doing, but back then I didn't. But if you were to go back and watch that, he's very much the same, saying really inappropriate things at the death of his children. And it just registers with us. It's not a normal response. It's not a well-adjusted response. It's an emotionally immature response, deeply concerning. Also, they're heard laughing together whilst they're waiting for a taxi just after the death. This is not what we would ever envisage as a reality in a reaction. At the end of the day, people react in a whole heap of ways when death occurs, but laughing is not one when it's associated with baby death under any circumstances. They are literally laughing together. This is ultimately strange behaviour for two grieving parents. I've never heard of it before. Like I said, unless the parents happen to be the murderer. I've heard of that before. When you think about Diane Downs, another one, kept laughing in the most inappropriate of places. Again, I've done a video on her, but it'll give you that sense of what's known as duper's delight, where people think they've got away with it, and yet they're kind of giggling and laughing in inappropriate places, or smiling when they should be looking really sad. These are real triggers, because most adults who are hardwired to be pro-social and are well-adjusted and are caring, when somebody acts in that way, it registers in a very strange way. It's primordial almost. You kind of instantly think there is something broken in this person. This isn't an acceptable thing. And that's why you don't even need morality and ethics. You don't need people to tell you what you should act like. It's just in you. We just know that's wrong. Another thing that's overheard, when Finley's body is in the actual hospital chapel of rest, Marsden goes and visits and literally says the words, "His dad's battered him to death. I didn't protect him." Now, I appreciate we can look at that several ways. On one way, we can go, oh, so she's starting to acknowledge the reality and consequences of their actions. She's realizing that she has allowed her son to be horribly murdered by this man, but she's saying it now because she's recognized the error of her ways. And that happily leads into a potential suggestion that, of course, I was just a victim too. I was scared of him too. So even though on one level it looks like she might be taking some responsibility, what I think is very clear is she's laying a layer of, I'm not that accountable, because at the end of the day, how could I ever fight against a man who is so much stronger than me when I'm just an innocent individual who was also in an abusive situation? You can see her purposefully, willfully, and absolutely laying that foundation. Now, Marsden and Boden get interviewed. Of course they do, because when it's a child death, it's incredibly important to figure out how this child has come to harm, and also to bring those individuals who are responsible of it and for it to justice. But they start to just try to explain Finley's injuries away. They're just trying to come up with all these excuses. It was just accidental, even though nobody needs any medical qualifications or actually any investigative qualifications to look at a child and go, this child has been seriously abused. You don't need any of those to see that the injuries are non-accidental. So it's so easy for the professionals to see that this is a non-accidental death. When the officers go to the home, because obviously they do that very quickly, it can be absolutely devastating for parents who lose a baby or a child, and the police turn up really quickly because it makes them feel like they're instantly guilty, and obviously they're dealing with the grief and loss and horror of a child death. But the reason the police do it is because they don't want you to have any time, should you be guilty of anything, to hide anything that's incriminating or to change sheets, wash things, etc. This is really important. It's very upsetting for loving parents who lose children, but this is the way it works. So it will be quick that they get there, and they are horrified. They are absolutely horrified. These are people who work in this area a great deal, and it is something that turns their stomachs. The squalid conditions are appalling, and it's obvious when you compare them to those pictures that were sent, the photographs that have been sent to basically say they were doing a good job, that was just totally superficial. It was just something they'd done to fool the authorities. Again, calculation. So as soon as those pictures had been sent, the property had basically gone straight back to that unclean, hazardous, disgusting state. Also, they found loads of cannabis paraphernalia, so they could see they were still taking drugs. They found out-of-date baby formula, so they weren't even caring for what Finley was actually ingesting. They looked at the fact that there were just bins full, overflowing. There was dirt and rubbish all over the floor. And this blindsides me. It really does. Listen, you can be untidy in your home, but when we're talking about this kind of level, it's completely unnecessary. It really doesn't take more than 10, 15 minutes every day, even when you're busy with kids, to just get rid of the stuff that can be problematic, like things that are going off or throwing out out-of-date food. This is really easy. I have no reasonable explanation to give regarding why people wouldn't do that, unless they have hoarding on the OCD spectrum and it's literally a psychological crisis point, but that's not what we're talking about here. They had dirty plates piled up in the kitchen. They saw that there were holes punched in the walls and kicks into the doors. So again, we're seeing the violence that ensued in that household. When they looked at Finley's cot in his bedroom that had been put in his parents' bedroom, essentially, that's where it was filthy. So to put it in context, when they looked at his clothes, when they looked at his bed covers, they were covered in spit, blood, phlegm, vomit, and feces. How dare they? How dare they? Honestly, how dare they do that to this child? I mean, evidence of their disrespect and their neglect all over what he should have been wearing. They found mold on the curtains. They found a bottle of Calpol. For those of you who don't know what Calpol is, in the UK, Calpol is often given to children. It's like a paracetamol, and it's what you give kids if they're grumbling and struggling, they've got some pain, they're teething. A lot of parents swear by it. So that's contextual. We expect to see it. What you don't expect is to see that bottle surrounded by spliff ends and empty cans of energy drink. And the chances are they were probably just dosing him up because they wanted him to sleep, even though he was in agony. When the medical examiners had to look at what had happened to him, they established the horrific reality. So Finley had suffered during that 39 days, let's always keep this in mind, it's 39 days in his parents. And I use that word lightly. I feel like abductors would be better. I feel like torturers would be better. I feel like anything. And I know that people will be like, well, they didn't abduct him. Well, they kind of did, because they lied through their teeth to accomplish their end game, which was to get him back. So he should never have been returned there. As far as I'm concerned, it's like taking without consent, because no one could consent to the reality. He had suffered during those 39 days 130 separate injuries. And just let me explain this. Those 130 separate injuries, they included 57 bone breaks and fractures. 57 bone breaks and fractures. It included 46 rib fractures. Now, I know a lot of you will have had rib fractures. I have had rib fracture. One is agonizing. You can't breathe. It's so painful. And you can't quite believe that a little injury to a rib can cause you that much pain, but my God, it does. He had 46 rib fractures. They had the spiral break to the thigh. Now, a spiral break is when you twist. I know that there'll be people out there who, for example, if a child falls, they grab them, and sometimes that can cause a spiral break. Of course, occasionally, it is not down to anybody doing anything abusive, but we're talking in context of the reality of these injuries. So this spiral break was caused by twisting. He had a broken shin bone. Again, any of you runners out there, if you've got shin splints, you'll know how painful they are. He had a broken shin bone. That means that the likelihood is he would have been held by the ankle and then gripped and twisted. He also had a broken collarbone. and a pelvis. I just want you to consider the fact that the pelvis is the strongest bone in the body. So even in a baby, it would have been considerable force that needed to be used to actually break it. And when they were concluding how this injury might have happened, they felt the most likely reality was he would have been kicked or he would have been stamped on. A baby, a beautiful little boy, kicked or stamped on. In fact, when they examined his body, they concluded that the injuries he had suffered were similar to those expected from a multi-story fall. Just let that sink in. A multi-story fall. On top of these horrific, unsurvivable injuries, at least because of the length of time they waited to get any treatment, they also found that his body was covered in 71 bruises and cuts and burns. So the 2 burns they found, one they said was from a hot flat surface and another was from a cigarette. When they looked inside his mouth, they also saw that the inside was torn. And the reason that they think that had occurred was it was likely that they'd shoved a dummy in or a bottle in, but it had been done really forcefully. And you can imagine the agonising pain that would have caused. When they looked at what had actually meant that he had died, they said it was a combination of pneumonia and endocarditis. So endocarditis is actually an infection causing the inflammation of the inner lining of the heart's chambers and valves. And because it had been untreated, it had turned into sepsis. Now, even though every single one of those injuries is absolutely heinous, I mean, the breaks alone just make you feel like you want to vomit. When you look at each of them, none of them would have actually been fatal on their own. But when you amalgamate them and you prevent treatment, his body had just given out. He would have been absolutely exhausted from the severe infection. That would have spread throughout his body. He'd have been in constant pain because of these injuries I've talked about. I mean, the fractured ribs alone would have made breathing difficult, breathing agonising even. And what's utterly tragic is that if anybody had intervened, so if his parents had taken him to the GP or to the hospital, or if a health worker had met him and seen him, they would have been able to give him treatment and he would probably have survived. But because his parents were so concerned about themselves, their drugs, not being caught and not caring, they just acted to protect themselves. You know, going to hospital would have shown that they'd been abusers, because it was obvious to anybody who's a seasoned care worker, to a doctor, to a nurse, that these are clearly abusive. And they were all done at different times. So you would look and see that you're not just dealing with an accident, there are historic realities to the injuries. So that would have been something that would have meant they would have immediately recognised that repeated abuse have occurred on multiple occasions. They actually even, when they examined his body, found cannabis in his bloodstream. Now that could be because they were literally just around smoking cannabis, but it could also be that they were trying to give blowbacks to him, calm him down because he was in so much pain. Who knows what they were doing with that cannabis near him? Now, this is a really serious reality for investigators because it's clear they're dealing with murderers. It's as simple as that. So both Boden and Marsden, they get initially charged and arrested in late December 2020, but then they're released on bail. And I guess we can say, well, there wasn't a child that they could have gone and injured elsewhere. So at the end of the day, bail seems like a reasonable reality. I just say throw them into prison, get them into remand. They don't deserve to breathe a shred of oxygen in our community when they've acted this way. But one of the bail conditions that they actually stipulate is that they can't have contact. But of course, what we know about these two is they don't listen to anyone. They just do whatever they want. So they just carry on having a sexual relationship during this time, and they continue this massive web of lies. So Boden, because they have like 1.5 brain cells, and each of those brain cells is in complete conflict with one another, because clearly what you would be doing in the circumstances that we're talking about now is either shutting up or just admitting your guilt and not thinking about ridiculous excuses. So yeah, Boden's like, what happened was a family dog probably caused Finley's multiple broken ribs by jumping on him. Yeah, I mean, that happens all the time. If you're not round at your friends, with your baby, with the family dog, just injuring them constantly, breaking the ribs, probably the pelvis, you know, causing massive internal problems, what are you doing? I mean, it's just the most obvious thing that happens all the time. I'm constantly seeing dogs, particularly family dogs, that are loved and are very gentle. They're always going for babies and trying to see how many particular ribs they can break that day. But yeah, Boden genuinely is trying to twist a narrative and thinks that everyone is equally as stupid as them. Also claimed that the reason there were marks to the mouth had been caused by Finley hitting himself with a rattle. Because again, if you aren't commonly watching children, little babies with little rattles, just constantly abusing themselves, hitting themselves in the face, I mean, you're not parenting, are you? Anybody who's ever had a child in the history of having a child knows that the moment that they clout themselves by mistake in the lips with a rattle, you're dealing with hysteria. And that is also why a lot of rattles these days are actually coated in soft materials, so you get the little rattle sound without the potential screaming when they've made a mistake. You don't get them going, oh, that really hurt, let me do it again. Oh, that really hurt, let me do it again. Oh, that really hurt, let me do it again. But this is, of course, the deflection of blame onto an innocent little baby. How could we expect more, though, from this reprobate? Now, during the police interviews, of course, none of them are going to admit that they had been involved in this sustained abuse. But Boden is, of course, trying to give explanation for the baby's injuries. And he's like, well, apart from the dog and the rattle, obviously, because they've obviously been tested out on a friend and the friend's been like, yeah, none of that makes sense. Don't go with that story. So instead, he's like really formulated a plan now. Wait a minute. I am a loving parent. I would not abuse my child. How can I evidence this in spite of the fact that my child is horrifically injured and literally looks like it's been dropped from a multi-story car park? What I will say is, oh God, you know what? On reflection, because I love him so much, I realised I may have rocked him too hard. Yeah, claim that Finley, because obviously this is driven by Finley's needs, liked being rocked fast and strong. Fast and strong? I mean, fast and strong. The only reason you would get the injuries we're talking about, and I'm probably exaggerating the injuries, is if you decided to use a fast and strong rocking movement in a tumble dryer. That's the only level compares to being so fast and so strong that the rocking movement could cause these kind of injuries. And he's like, yeah, I didn't really intend to harm him, but it turns out I'm an X-Man and didn't realise my incredible strength. Literally, is there not room in these cases for a cattle prod? Seriously, just like stun them when they come out with this BS. Now, it's during this investigation they do some forensic work, of course. Not that they, I think, need a lot of it, because can we all be honest that these two are bang to rights every single day of the week? But they confiscate Marsden and Boden's shared mobile phone, and they actually find lots of messages that just indicate the priorities that they've got in life, and also the attitude, I suppose you would say, towards that little boy. So one of the texts from Boden to his dealer, which is in reference to Finley, read this: little one effing kept me up all night. I want to bounce him off the walls. Ha ha. Oh dear God, please let him share a cell with somebody far bigger than him. You know, I, like so many of you, have a very dark sense of humour, and I, like so many of you, have children, and not once in my entire experience of being a parent have I ever written something that symbolises a desire for violence towards them. it just would never happen. It cannot come from me. There is such a visceral, cerebral link to my babies that no matter how old they got, all I wish for them is peace, joy, love, and happiness and safety. And that really disturbs me. And if I got a text like that of one of my friends, I'd be deeply concerned about the welfare of the child. It's an inappropriate reality in exchange. Now, following the substantial police investigation with respect, they put a hell of a lot of resources into this. They were not going to let these individuals get away. This almost feels personal, and I love it. The authorities felt that this little boy had been massively let down, and they wanted to make sure that Boden and Marsden were absolutely brought to justice. So they end up getting arrested again in early 2022. And this time, thank the Lord, they get remanded in custody. And I bet it's only at this point that the two absolute losers start to realise, hey, hang on, maybe this incredible web of deceit regarding the dog that could have caused the rib breaks and me just tenderly rocking my child as if I was an industrial washing machine or dry cleaner, that hadn't worked, you know? So at this point, they're separated, but that doesn't break their relationship down. No. In spite of the fact that they've been separated but still been having sex, and now in spite of the fact that they're separated by literally institutions, they still keep in contact. So they're sending each other Valentine Day letters and cards, and in them, Marsden declared that she would love Boden forever and would always be standing by him. It's like a really bad version of the criminal Romeo and Juliet, without the ending that most of us would desire for this too, genuinely. It's like some twisted version, isn't it? When you think about love, you don't think about these two. The one thing, of course, that is missing from those letters is a mention of their gorgeous 10-month-old baby boy that they had brutally abused and murdered. But like, why would she be thinking about him? I mean, he's just collateral. He's not important. He doesn't matter. Now, the pair eventually get charged with murder, 2 counts of child cruelty and 2 charges of causing or allowing the death of a child. And they plead not guilty to all the charges. Honestly, I imagine that the people defending them were like, sorry? Yeah, we're going not guilty. Why? Because they're not guilty. But all the evidence suggests that you're really, 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 really guilty. We know that, but we're going to go not guilty anyway because, like, we are in love and it's all going to be fine and we're going to be freed and get to live our lives again as if none of this happened. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Do you know what? It's far better, just going to throw it out there, to just say, we were guilty. We made mistakes. We didn't realise. And then you have a shot at reducing your sentence. We're not guilty. Okay, you are guilty though. Well, I know I'm guilty, but I'm just going to go with not guilty anyway. Can you just take some advice? No. Yeah. Actually, don't take any advice because secretly in my heart, I wish you will burn for eternal hell from today. I imagine that's how they felt. I might be wrong. I might just be adding my own ideas to this. If you are the person who wanted to defend them and you felt that they were not guilty, obviously I'm just throwing it out there that you too could probably do with a reality check. But I'm sure, like I said, that you probably feel the same way. So we get to November 2022, and this is when the trial begins. It begins at Derby Crown Court. Marsden's defence barrister, of course, has thought long and hard about this. Like, there's no way this girl's getting away with it, right? So as a defence barrister, you have to cry and think about the defence that's going to be effective in front of a jury. Remember, you only need to cast reasonable doubt. If that's the level and bar, you just have to make the jury go, oh, is she responsible for murder or is she a victim herself? So the way the defence barrister paints it is, she'd been in the thrall of an abusive partner and she was unable to cope with motherhood. So basically she's being painted as a victim. She's too afraid to report the abuse. And because of this, she's just a secondary party to the murder. Like, genuinely, that defence, I get where they're going, but the idea of painting this woman as a secondary party to the murder is like painting Myra Hindley or Rose West that way. She's female. She was a secondary party. I think you'll find that literally injuries show that she was covering his mouth whilst the other guy was beating the child, but she was secondary because it wasn't her fist punching the child. But it was her hand over his mouth. But she was a secondary party. Honestly, she's as secondary party as, like I said, the serial killers I've just mentioned. Yes, she had a vagina, but that does not mean that somehow she is exonerated from the hell we've described for this child and his demise. But the prosecution, who were no doubt rubbing their hands together, oh, I'm liking this is going to be great because I'm going to destroy the defence. They were like, well, you know what, as a secondary party victim who is so afraid of this particular person that they've allowed him to murder her child, she has continued to write to him, profess her love for him, and even ignore the fact that they even had a child during the communication whilst they're remanded in custody. You know, she would have had a perfect opportunity to escape and admit how scared she was, but she didn't. Because that's the thing about these kind of individuals. Narcissism, even though they're not the brightest of individuals, runs within their veins. And because of that, they're completely unable to realise that those protestations are going to fall on deaf ears because of their own actions. She had been complicit in the abuse. The prosecution made it clear. She was not an innocent bystander. Now, Boden, who now has got his partner saying, oh, it did happen, but I was just like an innocent victim. So now that is validating the fact that he is an aggressive killer. He decides that his best defense is to just go, I did not harm Finley. I didn't harm him. So even though it's clear he did, he thinks, well, I'll just deny everything and hopefully in the end people will believe me. So we get to April 2023. Now the trial lasted several months. It was a big old trial and it takes 10 days of deliberation, which is a lot of time spent deciding what the consequences will be for these two, if there are going to be any. The jury come back and they find both Marsden and Boden guilty of murder. And that is a good day for justice, a really good day. We get to the 26th of May 2023, Boden and Marsden are sentenced. We've got 22-year-old Marsden. She's given life with a minimum term of 27 years. Music to my ears. Music to my ears. A minimum term of 27 years. Massively unlikely that she'll ever get to be near another child. Very unlikely she'd ever get to have a child again. So we have taken that from her, and that protects children in this world. We've got a 30-year-old Boden. He's given a minimum term of 29 years, so life again. But 29 years, these are strong sentences. I appreciate if you live in America, it probably still feels minimal because you probably get life without parole. But this is big in the UK. The judge showed them no mercy, genuinely, described them as persuasive and accomplished liars. I would argue that they're not the most accomplished liars. They're not that persuasive either. I mean, I think during COVID, maybe they were because they could get away with manipulating the system. But I think from the point where they were discovered, there was not very much persuasive or accomplished about them. But I appreciate that the judge wants to make it clear the kind of mindset of these losers. They also said that they had inflicted unimaginable cruelty on their son and that neither had shown any remorse for their actions. Thank God that reality of justice kicked in and these two are given a sentence that actually makes sense. They didn't get away with manslaughter, didn't get away with neglect, you know, all the things that we often see thrown in. No, they were given the punishment that they absolutely deserved. Now, Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Services, that's CAFCAS. Bear in mind, sorry, I appreciate some of you will work CAFCAS. In my experience, there have been some bad experiences with my clients with CAFCAS and some of the decisions made. So I appreciate it's a contentious debate over how people feel about this service. But it's supposed to represent the child in the family court hearings. That's the job. And it's meant to mean that they decide what's in the best interests of the child. They claimed, and this is why they get so many negative responses in certain situations with respect. They claim that no one could have predicted Marsden and Boden would murder Finley. No one. Well, on paper, right at the beginning, I reckon that all of us realised that they could have ultimately been a terrible threat. And can we just bring back in social services?
who had absolutely, in their social care practice, been in their social care practice, been very concerned about Finley's welfare. They had stated specifically that he could be at risk of suffering from neglect, physical and emotional harm and abuse. That's what they had stated. They categorically stated, we think he may be at risk. But Kafkas, in spite of those recommendations of that gradual transition and drug testing to mitigate those risks, were rejected by the court. In fact, The Guardian, and I use that very, very loosely in this context, The Guardian appointed by Kafkas stated during the custody proceedings that she was involved in that she was not satisfied that a 4-month transition plan was in the interest of Finley or necessary to be drawn out for such a long period. 4 months? That's a long period. 4 months passes so quickly. I literally blink and it's happened. I'm planning Christmas now, even though it's only June, because it's going to be here next Wednesday. That's the way time works. And the Kafkas worker, who's meant to be there to protect this little boy, thinks that that's too long, a safety measure. Was they psychic? Do they know things that we... Evidently not. Evidently not, even if they believe that they did. And you know, this is where the bias of power can often cloud people's vision. Oh, I'm going to say something that disagrees with all these professionals working on the case because I want to be super important. And I've seen this play out time and time and time again. And for social care workers who are listening to this, they will know exactly how upsetting that is, because they are the ones working on the case, and then somebody comes in and usurps the reality of their actions and the evidence of the plan that would be in the best interest of a child. In fact, if we're going to look at this contextually and fairly, it seems that the only person who didn't foresee a risk was the very one appointed to represent Finley's welfare. How tragically ironic. How devastatingly ironic. Finley's tragic case is yet another clear example that the system is not working, as far as I'm concerned. We've got 2 drug-addled wasters of oxygen who were allowed to somehow consistently fool and deceive professionals, whilst seemingly make no effort to hide their extensive drug use and to hide their squalid home. As soon as they regained custody, it all fell apart. This is despite, as far as I'm concerned, loads and loads of red flags. Finley gets left in this potentially hazardous environment. No safety precautions in place. And authorities concluded that there was actually no way of knowing if a longer transition period into Marsden and Boden's care could have saved Finley. How? How can authorities conclude that? How can authorities conclude that a longer transition period with them being supervised and drug tested would not have had an impact? Really? Surely if he'd remained in care to some degree for more time, all of those extensive injuries would have started to come to light. They'd have been spotted before he was murdered. And again, it's like authorities covering their own arses in light of common sense reality and logic being presented to them. It does not help anyone. We all know Finley would be alive if protocol had ensued that was appropriate and measured, that the social workers had actually stated would be necessary and that was rejected by the magistrate and supported by the Kafkas worker who thought that they knew better. At the end of the day, Finley's horrific parents, they are the ones responsible for his death without a doubt, but the courts and services that were meant to protect him need to acknowledge how they failed Finley. They enabled 2 neglectful, abusive parents to kill a defenseless baby, to murder a defenseless baby. Now, like I said, when you think about social services, they did their best, but they are massively underfunded. That means that caseworkers are dealing with 2, sometimes 3 times more cases than they should be. And that means that ultimately in our society, we reap what we sow, where we do not put the funds, where we do not put the actual policing and staffing. How can we expect outcomes other than this? So it's offensive that we are still, in light of what we know in our society, failing children so badly. Now, as usual, a child safeguarding review is going to take place. It will say what lessons can be learned. But for Finley, it makes no difference. Those recommendations are going to come too late. They came too late for baby P, for Victoria Clembe. For many, they came too late.
because they're reflective. They're about hindsight. And the fact that I can repeat other children who have fallen prey to this kind of abuse since the original investigations of somebody like Finley, it's testament to the fact that we don't learn. He was one of 36 children who died in England following the abuse and maltreatment in the home in 2020. 36 children died. Before that gorgeous little boy was placed in his parents' care, he had been described by professionals as a baby who loves to be held, but is also very eager to explore and play. A smiler who likes to shout and blow raspberries. My God. Let's just hope that that's how his loving relatives get to remember him, as a child who genuinely was once happy and once well loved. This case has been massively infuriating. I'm sure that you can tell that. I am so tired of telling the same story again and again. But I also think that it's testament to us failing to learn those lessons that we keep talking about. I'm glad justice was served. Some will feel not long enough, that they should be staying in prison for the rest of their lives. But in the UK system, it's very rare that we ever give a full life tariff. So this is quite a substantial sentencing. I hope that you guys feel the same incandescent rage that I feel. I hope that you also see how the systemic failings can mean that even when services do the absolute right thing, there are still these missteps that can occur that can cause such horrific realities for children who should be protected. I'd love to know your thoughts. Get in touch with me. For those of you who asked me to cover this case when I came to Chesterfield, I hope that I've done it justice. I hope that I've given Finley absolute legacy. I hope we remember his name, and I hope that we all join in celebrating the fact that those excuses for his carers will be waking up and going to sleep for a very, very long time in a very secure facility where they genuinely can't ever harm another child. Take care, guys. This 100% is dedicated to Finley, that little boy who was loud and smiley and cheerful, who loved blowing raspberries. Let's hope wherever he is, he's surrounded by light and love. Be safe, guys. See you again.